Statement of Faith of the Korean Methodist Church. Let us read together. We believe in the one God, creator and sustainer of all things, Father of all nations, the source of all goodness and beauty, all truth and love. We believe in Jesus Christ, God manifested in flesh, our teacher, example, and redeemer, the Savior of the world. We believe in the Holy Spirit, God present with us for guidance, for comfort, and for strength. We believe in the forgiveness of sins, in the life of love and prayer, and in grace equal to every need. We believe in the Word of God, contained in the Old and New Testaments, as the sufficient rule both of faith and of practice. We believe in the Church, those who are united in the living Lord for the purpose of worship and service. We believe in the reign of God as the divine will realized in human society, and in the family of God, where we are all brothers and sisters. We believe in the final triumph of righteousness and in the life everlasting. Amen.
I invite you to turn your attention with me to Genesis chapter 9, verses 8 through 17. Genesis chapter 9, verses 8 through 17. Hear the word of the Lord. Then God says to Noah and to his sons with him, "As for me, I confirm my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I confirm my covenant with you, that never again is all flesh cut off by the waters of a flood. And never again is there a flood to destroy the earth." God says, "This is the sign of the covenant I make between me and you and every living creature with you for all future generations. I set my bow in the clouds, and it is a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I remember my covenant between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters never again are a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I see it and remember the enduring covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh on the earth." God says to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I confirm between me and all flesh on the earth." Word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
On the evening of Ash Wednesday, we spoke of grace. We considered how grace meets us before we have any way to make ourselves prepared, worthy of reconciliation or forgiveness. We looked at how grace does not consider the concept of being worthy or unworthy. We looked at grace as framing for God's plan of redemption, a plan that flows out of God's great love for us and for all of creation. In counterpoint, I often hear people refer to the flood narrative in Genesis as presenting a very harsh counter-argument. When we read the whole text, however, we find that God is hanging up here his bow, a weapon, hanging it up in the clouds. Do we recognize that commitment by God not to deal in violent retribution? No doubt, as many of you, I grew up with an understanding that this Noah's story was a very harsh story. It was punishment. This was a picture of how God deals with sinners. It was a portrait of condemnation writ large that we needed then somehow to escape this aspect of God who is judgmental and condemning, wrathful, angry at sin, and somehow must punish sin at all costs. Such a read contrasts very sharply to Jesus, doesn't it? That never really came up when I was growing up. When I was hearing comments on the flood story and Jesus, it was as though they were separate conversations that had no connection one with the other. Then my dad introduced me to the basic outlines of myths from that part of the world, from Mesopotamia, Babylon. Myths of floods and creation that spoke in very different terms of a worldwide flood. He helped me see that this narrative is told in response to those other narratives, the other tales which circled among the peoples who were neighbors of these Hebrews, at least as far back as when Abraham had left Ur of the Chaldees, and again when they were in exile in Babylon. What we find in Genesis is a theological response. It's a response to the theologies of Babylon, Egypt, the rest of that part of the world, and the stories that they told about who the gods were, their character, and how we could and should approach them. To set the scene, a little background is in order. The Epic of Gilgamesh is probably the most known of these narratives coming from Babylon. We have a copy of it in tablets that dates back to 2500 BCE, long before we have anything written in the Hebrew scriptures. Gilgamesh was king of Uruk. He was famous for having built a wall around the city, one of the first fortified cities, in the middle of the 3rd century BCE. Within this tale, Utnapishtim relates a flood narrative to Gilgamesh. The god Enlil was having difficulty sleeping because these people down on earth were making such a racket. They were just too noisy. So Enlil devised this strategy whereby he was going to send a flood and wipe out life on earth, and then he would finally be able to get some sleep. Karen, I don't suggest you try to get rid of the cat to help you sleep. Wipe them all out. We'll have some peace and quiet. But then one of the other deities decides that this is not the best way to approach things. And he lets Utnapishtim know of this plot that has been devised. And he tells Utnapishtim, go and build this huge box. We're told the box covered an acre of land and was a perfect cube. It's high and wide and long, every dimension the same, divided up into 9 rooms on each of 7 floors. A huge endeavor that Utnapishtim carries out. He uses all of his wealth to do so and builds it in 5 days. Phil, you need to do a better job in construction. Tell the other Phil he's too slow. 5 days. He fills it with gold and silver, and he gathers all these animals from over the earth and brings them and all his kinfolk into this box, and he shuts the door. And everything he has done, he has become the hero. The flood comes and it rages for some 12 days, not 40. At the end of some time, Utnapishtim opens a skylight to see, and he can see the peaks of some mountains in the distance. He begins later releasing some birds, and then he finally decides that after one of the birds is not returning, that it is time to open the ark, and so he opens this box and releases all the animals that are in there along with his family, and he offers a sacrifice to the gods, and the text says that they come down swarming like famished birds to eat from the altar. See, Utnapishtim has become a hero to the gods. They have been starving because there's been no one to offer sacrifice to them. And this concept of sending the flood upon the earth has backfired because they didn't think things through. Man had been created to till the land and offer sacrifices so that the gods could eat. And now, in thankfulness to Utnapishtim, this hero who has saved the gods, he is granted immortality. Does that sound a little different from the story of Noah to you? Some of the aspects are the same, right? There's an ark, there's a flood, there's someone building it. But God takes Noah and he says, Noah, I want you to build an ark, and Noah takes 100 years to get the thing built. And it might be a sixth the size of the one Utnapishtim builds in 5 days. God leads the animals to the ark. God shuts the door. The flood lasts, what? The rain comes down for 40 days and 40 nights. Noah and his family remain on the ark for a full year. This is a rather long-range plan, isn't it? It's a very different character portrayed of who God is. In fact, when we are introduced to Noah in chapter 6, we find that his name is associated with 3 other terms in Hebrew. One for wipe out, one for grace, one for regret. God is regretting the state of creation because it says humanity has destroyed the earth. It's not a tale then that God is trying to destroy something that is working. It's rather that God is putting to rights something that we have already destroyed. The text says Noah found grace in God's eyes. And God decides to begin everything anew. And he redeems life on earth by taking life, protecting it, and then reestablishing creation as it was supposed to have been. That's the tale we have in Genesis. Very different character. Very different God. God's care and love for creation is what has set in motion this whole story, the whole narrative of Noah. Yahweh is not bothered by humans being too noisy, too rowdy. Yahweh's sleep has not been disrupted. In fact, in some texts it'll tell us that Yahweh does not sleep, right? Yahweh is not acting on some irascible, spur-of-the-moment whim. He sets in motion a plan that takes a long time to come out. Throughout this time, we have no record of Noah making the first initiative, not even saying a word. We have an humble servant who simply does what he's told. God gives him the instructions on how to build the ark. That's different from the Babylonian myth. God tells him exactly how long and how wide and what materials to use and how to seal it. And God does all of the special things like bringing the animals aboard. Noah is simply a silent partner in Yahweh's plan to give the earth a fresh start, to redeem it after the destruction that we, humanity, have caused. He's just a tool in Yahweh's employ. This humble servant who has done nothing other than follow orders is the recipient now of Yahweh's promise. Yahweh confirms the divine covenant with creation. This is a reaffirmation of covenant that God has already bestowed, though now it is tweaked a bit. God's promise here that never again will a flood come to wipe out the earth, to reset it. But this is not really a new covenant, except that it is an expanded covenant. It is not simply between God and humanity. It is now a covenant between God and all of creation. Every form of created life. It is Yahweh's promise to preserve life in all of its varied manifestations. In the midst of narrating this covenant, confirmation and reaffirmation, Yahweh reports having stored his bow in the clouds. Hebrew doesn't have a specific term for rainbow. This term could mean rainbow or bow, like a bow and arrows. It actually means both. And as we look at it, we're not supposed to distinguish between rainbow and bow as a weapon. The rainbow is God's weapon. Stored in the clouds where we can see it, but also cut off from where God resides. The bow stands now between us. If God is going to use the bow to tear open the heavens and allow the waters to come down and flood the earth, God has to come down to the earth to do it. The structure of the universe as they understood it was that there were waters under the earth. There's the flat layer of earth on which we live, and then there is a bowl-shaped thing they called a firmament that sits upon the earth and keeps these other heavenly waters at bay. And God would generally open windows in this firmament to fill up the clouds to bring water over the earth. But now this bow of God, this weapon, is no longer up in heaven above this firmament. It is now below the firmament in the clouds, where we can keep an eye on it, is what the story says. Where we can see it, where we can recognize it, and notice that it is not within God's reach. As with Yahweh's other covenants, this covenant is one-sided. Who are we, after all, to bargain terms with God? Yahweh dictates the terms. Yahweh secures the covenant. Yahweh is the negotiator. Yahweh offers the agreement. Yahweh ratifies it. Yahweh brings it to pass and guarantees its terms. All of this is on Yahweh, not on us. Just like Noah building the ark, there is no need here of any human initiative. Each aspect of the covenant promise originates in and falls back on Yahweh. It is a gift. It is a gift that cannot be earned. It's a covenant of grace. Because that's the definition of grace, isn't it? A gift that you could do nothing about. The very flood itself was an act of grace. It was Yahweh cleaning up our mess. As much as the flood narrative is a theological response to Babylonian myths, its portrayal of Yahweh goes further. It's more than simply showing Yahweh as a God of order, planning, creating, and restoring. This is a God of grace, of mercy, second chances. A God who is concerned for more than just a few human beings. Yahweh's concern encompasses the entirety, not only of humanity, but of creation. Rather than some self-absorbed entity, this is the God who cares for the sparrows who fall from the sky. Our chaos is not of God. Our chaos is of our own making. The violence enacted upon creation around us is a destruction originating from our own hands. God is not seeking to punish with the forces of nature or striking people down with lightning bolts. That would be Zeus. Yahweh's bow is set in the clouds to remind us of the identity of the one in whom we are secure. That security is ours through grace. Grace that grants rest and renewal. That's what was said back in Genesis 6. Through Noah, creation will find rest. Because Noah found grace in the eyes of God. I invite you to turn with